Okay, hello everyone and welcome to the Chaburat. Today we have a fascinating shiur with Rabbi Dr. Reichman on contemporary Jewish medical ethics through the eyes of HaRambam. Tonight's shiur is presented by the Chaburat in partnership with the Torah Terefua Institute. Formed by Dr. Elisha Khan just over a year ago, the Torah Terefua Institute consists of senior dayanim and rabbanim with an expertise in the field of medical halacha and medical professionals from the UK and abroad. Many accomplished authors, rabbinic community leaders, and senior physicians are part of the group. The aims of the group are to create streamlined access to these senior poskim, create opportunities for further education and training of rabbanim, doctors, and community members in the field of medical halacha. About the Chabura, we are an online and virtual Bet Midrash inspired by the classical Sephardi approach to Torah and dedicating to studying Mikra, Halacha, Talmud, Machshava, and Chokhmah from all areas of worldly knowledge. We have an impressive network of Talmidim from around the world, many insightful shiurim, get-togethers, a journal, and a publishing house. Thank God we just came out with our first book on Pesach, which is available on Amazon for purchase. About our speaker, Edward Reichman is a professor of emergency medicine and professor in the Division of Education and Bioethics at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine of Yeshiva University, where he teaches Jewish medical ethics. He received his rabbinic ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary of Yeshiva University and writes and lectures internationally in the field of Jewish medical ethics. He has been a mentor of the Medical Ethics Society of Yeshiva University since its inception. His research is devoted to the interface of medical history and Jewish law. He's also author of the new book, The Anatomy of Jewish Law, published by Yeshiva University and OU Press. As usual, all our classes are recorded and will be available later on our website. Please raise your hand if you have questions, and please God, we will also have time for questions at the end. With that said, thank you everyone for joining, especially the Rabbanim and Dayanim who have joined us this week, including Rabbi Akiva Tatz, Baruchim Abayim. Rabbi Reichman, it is a privilege to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. A tremendous chus for me to join two really outstanding organizations. The Chabura and the Torah Terefua are really ideal vehicles of adult education. They are masterfully presented. They are of extremely high academic caliber, extremely professional. I learn and enjoy immensely from both of these platforms, and I wish you both continued success for many years. They're definitely going to continue to expand, and I know I view them as a role model in terms of how an online platform of adult education can really be run. So kol hakavod, or chazak u'baruch to you for the tremendous work that you do. I am joining you today to discuss a particular topic. The topic of our discussion is going to focus on the Rambam. We're really going to use the Rambam as a vehicle to discuss both history of medicine and contemporary medicine. And the title of our talk is If the Rambam Were Alive Today: Contemporary Jewish Medical Ethics Through the Eyes of Maimonides. Now let me start by asking you a simple, seemingly ridiculous question. If I were to ask you, who is this figure in the center of the slide, I suspect you would all say, of course, that's the Rambam. That's what our talk is about, is it not? The question is this really a picture of the Rambam? Do we know, in fact, that the Rambam looked like this? We do know, however, that this is definitely his signature, and we'll discuss where that signature comes from and how we do know that. But clearly, this image of the Rambam has become ubiquitous throughout the world. We find it in statues. We find it in circulation, in coins, on bills. The Rambam has definitely made his mark, but the Rambam has also made his stamp, if you will. The Rambam is actually on many stamps internationally. And in some places that you wouldn't necessarily think you'd find a stamp of the Rambam, including the Republic of Chad and Lesotho and Antigua and Grenada and Micronesia. However, this depiction of the Rambam, we only find it, the earliest we find it, is actually in the 18th century. And it was picked up from a thesaurus of Eugolinus by one of the great scholars, which I think you may have discussed in some of your sessions, Yitzchak Shmuel Reggio, and he picked it up from the Thesaurus of Eugalinus. But we don't have any record whatsoever of this depiction of the Rambam prior to that time period. And I suspect that the Rambam probably would not have had time to sit for a portrait. And how do we know this? We know this from the very famous letter, which I suspect many of you are familiar with. We actually today have a Rambam Yomi, which you can get on your cell phones now. But we also have a record of the Rambam's Yom, what a typical day for the Rambam looked like, and why it was unlikely that the Rambam would have actually had time to sit for a portrait. This is just an excerpt from a wonderful letter that if you haven't read, I suggest you read. It's a letter to Shmuel ibn Tibon. Shmuel ibn Tibon was from the famous translating family, the Ibn Tibon family, and was in the process of translating the Rambam's famous philosophical work, Moreh Nevuchim, and he wrote to the Rambam asking him if he could come visit him and discuss the translation. Translating in general is challenging. Translating the Rambam's philosophical work is really a monumental task. It's not the kind of thing that would be done easily. It's definitely something which would require clarification of terms and phrases and meaning with the author. So in essence, the Rambam wrote back to him, thank you very much. It's a wonderful idea. But I wouldn't bother. I wouldn't waste your time, in essence, because you could come visit me, but I really won't have any time to spend with you. And the Rambam begins to discuss exactly what his day consists of. He wakes up very early in the morning and goes to the palace to take care of King Saladin and his harem, and he's there for most of the day. And then he says he returns from the king's palace, and I'm ravenously hungry, and I find Exedros Kulam Maleos B'nei Adam, and I find the porticos, the courtyards completely filled with people awaiting my medical consultation. Goyim v'Yehudim, Jews and non-Jews, important, unimportant, judges, officers, Ohavim, Sonim. Basically, it's a great equalizer. Coming to visit the Rambam, I guess, for a medical consultation was the great equalizer. And he continues to describe how he would do many of his consultations leaning on his side because of pure exhaustion, barely had time to eat, and only after he finished his consultations would he do some of the writings that we are now privy to today, that we have spent hundreds of thousands of hours and hundreds of years learning and studying. Just an interesting brief tangent, because we're speaking to a group largely from the United Kingdom. The notion of Jews treating physicians, Jews treating kings and monarchs is not a new phenomenon. It was actually quite common throughout history. But I just share with you one really remarkable example. King Henry IV from the 1400s was in need of medical consultation. He was actually apparently not being healed by those who lived in England, so he sent away for a physician from Italy whose name was Elias Sabato. Elias Sabato was a Jew, and Elias Sabato said, I will come and treat you, Henry IV, but only on one proviso, and that proviso would be that I bring with me decim hominibus servientibus. Rabbi Tatz, you might remember this. I mentioned this passage in our previous meeting. So he said, I will come treat you, King Henry IV, on the proviso that I'm allowed to bring 10 men with me. Now, why would Elias Sabato request safe passage or safe conduct for 10 men? So I think you probably will be thinking correctly that he needed a minyan of people to come with him so he could daven with a minyan every day. couldn't he find a minyan in England? In all of England, couldn't Sabato find a minyan? The answer is no, he couldn't, because Jews had been tossed out of England centuries before. It wasn't until Oliver Cromwell, hundreds of years later, that the Jews would return to the country. And I always ask, why did he need to bring 10? He only needed another 9. So my assumption is, just like the Rambam spent most of his time at the palace, I suspect Sabato spent most of his time treating Henry IV at his palace. So these men would need 10 to have a minyan. If he didn't make it back from Mincha, only made it back from Marav, this way they would be able to have a minyan. You are all familiar, especially this elite and highly educated group, with the Rambam's halachic writings, with his Perush Mishnayos. Here's a manuscript, handwritten manuscript of the Rambam, the Perush Mishnayos. Mishnah Torah, also returning to England, is a famous manuscript of the Mishnah Torah, which is autographed, not handwritten by the Rambam, but autographed by the Rambam, which is held in the Bodleian Library. And it says Huga Misifri, meaning that it was compared to the Rambam's own handwritten edition, Ani Moshe B'Rabbi Maimon, and this is the signature of the Rambam that we find underneath the famous picture of the Rambam on the front slide. You're also familiar with the Moreh Nevuchim, the philosophical works of the Rambam. Here's a beautiful manuscript from the 1300s, and they are not infrequently at auction, rare editions you sometimes find at auction. This is an incunable. This is from the printing before 1500, and he printed works. So the Gutenberg press was 1454, roughly. All books printed before 1500 are called incunabula, or the infancy, the cradle, if you will, of printing. So those books are exceedingly rare. There aren't too many in the entire world of any types of printing, and you can imagine there's far fewer in Hebrew printed books. So when they do go for auction, they go for quite a sum of money. We do find a lot of the Rambam from the Cairo Geniza. I'm not going to really discuss extensively the Cairo Geniza. I'll mention some samples from the Cairo Geniza, but here again, this is something that you from the Chabura are familiar with. I actually attended the session. I don't remember exactly how long ago it was. You had a wonderful session on the Cairo Geniza from the curator of the collection in Cambridge, I believe. Correct? Who took over for Stefan Reif. It was an absolutely wonderful session. So the Cairo Geniza is fertile ground for manuscripts of the Rambam, and really has provided us a great insight into the works of the Rambam. And just to share with you, in case you are not familiar, but I suspect you probably are familiar because you are on top of the latest of academia. But there's a new book that has come out on the Cairo Geniza. Absolutely spectacular work called The Cairo Geniza and the Age of Discovery in Egypt. And it shares and opens up vistas into the Cairo Geniza far beyond the standard Schechter story and the 2 women from England who showed him the passage of Ben Sira, and enlightens to many, many more players in this remarkable history of manuscripts from the Mideast from that period of time. And I put here just this past week, a few days ago, Dr. Rebecca Jefferson, who authored this book, who is a curator. I think she's from England originally. She's a curator in a library in Florida of a Judaica collection, and she was interviewed in the Svarim Chatter podcast, which many of your viewers may be familiar with. If they're not, I think they would enjoy immensely. But she spoke about her work and this book, and it's just a fascinating talk that I recommend if you have time. We do find a number of relevant passages from the Cairo Geniza which shed light on the Rambam and his medical training and medical training in general for Jewish physicians in this period of time. So there's a famous letter which has been oft quoted by Meir ibn al-Hamadani to the Rambam, asking him to accept his son as his assistant for the study of medicine. Now, Alicia, I don't know if you have students that come and ask you to shadow you So I'm in the emergency room. It's a very typical place for people to ask if they could have their children, their sons or their daughters, come shadow in the emergency room to get exposure, to get experience. So the same was true for the Rambam. So this Meir ibn Hamadani asked the Rambam if his son could shadow the Rambam. And he says that he dared apply to him only because he had heard that the Rambam's nephew, who had worked under him thus far, now practiced elsewhere. He promises to pay Maimonides a higher honorarium than the former apprentice. This has been famously quoted. In the interest of academic honesty and scholarship, there are those who question whether, in fact, it doesn't say the Rambam's name explicitly, so there is some who question whether, in fact, this letter was to the Rambam. So Goitan, the famous scholar from the Cairo Geniza, claims that this was a letter to the Rambam. However, a contemporary scholar, Professor Friedman from Tel Aviv University, says the identification of Maimonides as the letter's recipient is not without difficulty. And he claims that there are a number of challenges in making that identification. And Goitan was actually his mentor and his professor. So he claims that he falls short of the mark in making that identification. But what we do have is in the Geniza, we do have examples of libraries of physicians in Egypt contemporaneous with the Rambam. And this is but one example. So we would have known what the average physician's library, likely a glimpse into what the library of the Rambam himself would have looked like. Here I just pull out one very interesting book from this library. In this article, the Judeo-Arabic is translated into Hebrew. It's transliterated and translated. So one of the works that you find in this library, and what you find in these libraries often, this happens to be the case, they are auctions of libraries of individuals, oftentimes after the individual died. So in these auctions, you find a list of all their Sfarim. And so you have their Sfarim, their Hebrew Sfarim, and also you have their medical works. So one of the works that you find in this list of a Jewish physician contemporaneous with the Rambam, translated into Hebrew, the name of the book was Hanoladim Lechet Chodeshim. People or children who are born at 8 months. Now, what exactly does that refer to? What exactly does that mean? For those of you who are not familiar, some of you who study the world of medical halacha, especially if you're interested in neonatology or a reproductive aspect of or Hilchos Bris, for example, you may have come across this notion that in Chazal you will find referenced an understanding about birth months and viability, and that if a child was born in the 7th month of gestation or after 7 months of gestation, that child would be considered viable. If the child was born after 9 months of gestation, that child would equally be considered viable. However, if a child was born in the 8th month of gestation, that child would be considered non-viable. And that was a very, very prominent notion. This notion was not at all unique to Chazal. If you just read it in the Gemara and the Rishonim and the Achronim, you might think so. But it was extremely prevalent in contemporaneous science for many, many centuries, was really only disproved in the modern era. And the Rambam himself discusses this famous case of Nolad B'Shmona, the child of Ches Chodoshim, in Hilchos Mila. And he writes, Misha Nolad B'Chodesh Hashmini, Im Hayasholem B'Sa'ara Tzippornav. If a child is born of 8 months gestation and his development reflects that he is a child of complete embryological development, then it is permissible to perform the bris on Shabbos. Aval, im nolad us'ara lakui ve'ein tzipornav shleimim kibriyason, hareze keben shmona vadai, shelo haya roi lehi v'leid, ela batisha v'yatsa kodem she'igomer. But if there's a physical reflection of the fact that the child is not completely developed, so the nails, for example, are not developed, the hair is not fully developed, etc., then it's a reflection that that child is considered an absolute ben shmona, a sort of a vadai ben shmona. So what's the consequence of that? The fikachu chashuv ke'even ve'asur l'taltalo b'Shabbos. And this is the halacha in Shulchan Aruch, that a child who is known to be born in 8 months of gestation is considered as if he wouldn't survive, non-viable. As such, it's usher to pick up the child, to move the child, and be usher to perform a bris on that child. And that was the halacha which the Rambam codified. That fast forward to today, not really our discussion today, the concept of nishtana teva, how things, understanding of medicine has evolved. Of course, that's part of our discussion, but that itself merits a fuller discussion. We today treat the 8-month baby, even if we know with absolute certainty the child is born in 8 months gestation, we would absolutely violate Shabbos to perform a milah for that child. And in fact, our notion or our understanding of neonatology is that the 8th month is better than the 7th month. There's more time for gestation, intrauterine gestation, and the 9th month, of course, is better. I'm not going to discuss their perceptions of this, but this is clearly a perception of the 8th month being unique, and there was such a concept of the 7th month gestation and a 9-month gestation, which were viable, and the 8th month, which was not. Returning to the types of books that would be used by the likes of the Rambam and any physicians of his time period, there's a work which collects from the Geniza all the medical and paramedical fragments. In the Cairo Geniza, it was collected by Haskell Isaacs, passed away a number of years ago. He was actually the head of the medical aspect of the Geniza. I had a chance to visit him in Cambridge a number of years ago. So in this work, if you just look at the index of this work, you will see, if you look up Galen, who's one of the major players in secular medical history. Galen, just to give you an idea, when Galen lived roughly contemporaneous with Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, first, second century of the Common Era. Hippocrates lived you're all familiar with, of course, roughly in the 5th century before the Common Era. So keep in mind, the Geniza are Hebrew fragments that Jews deposited in the Geniza. Look how many of these fragments they identified are from Galen. Look how many of these fragments they identified are from Hippocrates. So quite a few, which means that this was clearly part of the libraries of Jewish physicians at that time. And we have... and Alicia, I think you may have posted this or sent this to me, so I thank you for that. We have other records of the Rambam specifically relating to people in terms of the practice of medicine. This is from the Princeton Geniza lab, and we have this is an article actually by the very same person, Haskell Isaacs, who was the head of the medical Geniza that I mentioned. And this also, I think, Alicia, this you sent as well. This goes back from a tradition from a number of years ago, letter of the Rambam to his student, Yosef ben Yehuda ibn Aknin. By the way, Yosef ben Yehuda ibn Aknin was the recipient of the Moreh Nevuchim. He was the student to whom the Rambam addressed the Moreh Nevuchim. And the Rambam specifically says to him, my advice to you is to pay full attention to your trade and the practice of medicine, and at the same time, continue to study the Torah voluntarily. So he asked him if he should, if he should study Torah full-time or if he should take up another profession. So the Rambam recommended to him to continue his medical practice in addition to his Torah studies. And from this article from Professor Mordechai Friedman, he also mentions another reference that the Rambam clearly taught medicine from an Arabic manuscript, which he translates that he studied under other prominent masters of medicine who were at that time in Egypt, such as the Rais Musa al-Qurtubi, which is the author of the well-known works and others of his rank. And this is someone else talking about the people that he studied with. And this individual, Rais Moses of Cordoba, is clearly a reference to the Rambam. So the Rambam was, in fact, a teacher of medicine, in addition to the extraordinary halachic works that he left us. What were the Rambam's works actually comprised of? So the Rambam has a number of medical writings. He wrote on asthma, on hemorrhoids, on sexual health, and we'll see in a moment on preventive medicine as well. But just to give you a context of how medical history was in the pre-modern era, keep in mind the Rambam was in the 12th century, and he wrote a Perush, Lepirkei Avukrat. Now, do you guys have any idea who Avukrat might be? So Avukrat is actually Hippocrates. So the Rambam, many of you know the Rambam's Mishnah Torah and the Rambam's Perush and Mishnayos. You didn't know he wrote a Perush on Hippocrates, I suspect. And he also wrote a Perush on Galen. So these two extraordinary figures, whose manuscripts we find plentifully in the Cairo Geniza, were an integral part of medical practice and medical study at that time. And the Rambam actually wrote commentaries on their works. And here's an example. This, by the way, is a Hebrew translation of the works of the medical work of the Rambam by Zisman Muntner. The medical works of the Rambam were written in Arabic, not Judeo-Arabic, but pure Arabic. This is a translation of that Arabic to Hebrew. And here you have one small section. Amar Avukrat, Misha Hayamina Ubrim Zachar. If a child is male, Hine Ra'ui Sheyeh Gidulo Biyamin. It is more likely than not, or it is certain in this case, that he was conceived on the right side of the woman. Umisha Haya Mehem Nekeva Bismol. And if the child turns out to be a female child, a child was conceived or gestated on the left side. And this is a reference to the so-called right-left theory of sex determination, whether a child would be a male, whether a child would be a female. We'll talk about presently, we'll talk about a fascinating source in other contemporary Rishonim of the Rambam who addressed this, but the Rambam clearly did not have such positive words for this notion. And he writes, Ve'eni yodea im higia zeh b'nevua. So he writes about Hippocrates. I don't know where he got this idea from. There's no basis for this idea. Maybe he got it from a nevuah. Oshe Gila Behekesh. Maybe he had some kind of philosophical, analytical analysis, which he arrived at this conclusion. But either way, Hinehu Hekesh Nifla. If it is from a philosophical analysis, it is clearly not something that the Rambam agreed with, and thought it was rather incorrect, which is interesting in light of the fact that we find some contemporaneous Rishonim who discuss a very similar idea in a positive light. So we're coming up soon on Parshas Ki Tazria, and the pasuk begins Tazria Vaydaber Hashem Moshe Limor Isha Ki Tazria V'Yoldo Zachor. When a woman gives forth zera and gives birth to a male child, and then the Torah tells us about the different periods of Tumah V'Tara. This pasuk is a springboard for many fascinating discussions about reproductive anatomy and reproductive physiology throughout many centuries of rabbinic literature. And it's fascinating because each period of time reflects the understanding of anatomy and the understanding of physiology during that period of time. And this is one interesting example along the similar lines to that which the Rambam was not so fond of. And here you have in Paneach Raza and Dazakanim, who are Rishonim writing on this pasuk, Ki Sazria, and they write, Kosav Hagan B'Shem Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra was a contemporary of the Rambam. Shebihiyos sheberechem isha zayin chadorim. That the uterus of a woman has 7 chambers, gimel miyamin v'gimel mismol, 3 on the right and 3 on the left, ve'echad be'emtza. Ukshazera niklat b'shal yamin, and if the seed deposits on the right, teled zachar, she will conceive a male child. V'im b'shal smol, if it deposits on the left, she will conceive a female child. And what's going to happen if the child is conceived in the center chamber? So there are different approaches here. im be'emtza, so for example, Das Keni Balitosa says, tele tumtum o androgynous. It'll be either ambiguous genitalia or hermaphrodite, because if the right is male and the left is female, if there's one in the center, it'll have both male and female. Androgynous, andro like andrology is male, gynous like gynecology is female. It's a combination of the male and the female. This notion of the seven-chambered uterus is a fascinating notion. It does not find its expression anywhere before this period of time. It is not mentioned in the Gemara. It's not mentioned in the times of the Gaonim. Why it specifically expressed itself in this period of time is a matter of interest. We'll talk in a moment about the history of anatomy and anatomical dissection. You might ask yourself, didn't they simply know that if you dissect a female post-mortem, you would see there aren't 7 chambers in the uterus. There's only 1 chamber in the uterus. So the short answer to that, as we'll see momentarily, is no, they didn't know. And no, they didn't do dissection in any systematic fashion. But this nonetheless arose, and these are some of the depictions from the Middle Ages of this 7-chambered uterus. And interestingly, the Maharal picks up this notion of 7-chambered uterus with respect to the pasuk in Shmos, "Bnei Yisrael paruva yishvatzu vayirbu v'yatzmu b'mod ma'od v'timalei haaretz hasam," that we're all familiar with the Medrash Rabbah, which Rashi quotes, that the women of Mitzrayim, how do we explain the population explosion? So the answer is the women of Mitzrayim gave birth to sextuplets. So the Maharal picks up this 7-chambered uterus, and he said, the miracle wasn't that they gave birth to as many as 6. The miracle was they only gave birth to 6. Because potentially the woman could have given birth to 7 based on this notion of the 7-chambered uterus. However, if she would have given birth to 7 at a time, then by necessity, one of those 7 would have been deposited in the center chamber, and the child would have been either an androgynous or a tumtum, and that would have been a klola. So it's an interesting example of co-opting contemporaneous science and medicine into commentary. Today, I'm not sure if he's actually completed the project, but he's clearly near completion. Gerrit Boss, who I actually met many years ago when I spent some time at the Wellcome Institute in London, in Euston, near Euston Station. And he was beginning some of his work then, but he is an absolute master of medical, historical Hebrew manuscripts and literature, and he has done an extraordinary job of translating from the original Arabic the Rambam's medical works. So if you have a serious interest in the Rambam's medical works, this would absolutely be the work that you would need to see. I don't know how many of you have the Maimonides prayer for the physician. Alicia, do you have that? You have a copy at home? You don't have a copy? I happen to have a copy right here. This is my, actually, I don't know if you can see it because the background is fading in and out. There you go. So this, my parents, Aleim Hashalom, got this for me many years ago from the famous olive factory. I don't know how many of you remember the olive factory on Rehov Mei Yesharim. You get all these interesting things. So I hope for those of you who do have it, I hope you kept your receipts for the following reason. The Tfilos HaRofe authored by the Rambam was in fact not authored by the Rambam. It is falsely attributed to the Rambam. It was actually written by a physician much later in history. It was written by Marcus Hertz in the late 18th century. Marcus Hertz, fascinating figure of the Haskalah. He penned a prayer, and the literary conceit at that time was to write things in the style of famous authors of previous generations, either from antiquity or earlier centuries. And he wrote a prayer in the style of what he would have anticipated the Rambam would have written. He did not hide that fact. Just with the passage of time, his name got left off the bottom, and people just attributed the tefillah to the Rambam when in fact it wasn't written by the Rambam. And Dr. Yoshua Leibovitz, who's the cousin of Nechama Leibovitz, exposed that fact in an article in the 1950s in Dapim Refuim. But what if the Rambam were alive today? How would he paskin? What would he have to say about some of these really exciting things? I share with you, just for a brief moment, an essay inspired by Soloveitchik, where he writes the following, and it's really a beautiful essay. Just read a small excerpt of it. The rabbi is seated and sees before him rows of young beaming faces, clear eyes radiating the joy of being young. For a moment, the rabbi is gripped with pessimism, with tremors of uncertainty. He asks himself, can there be a dialogue between an old teacher and young students, between a rabbi in his Indian summer and students enjoying the spring of their lives? The rabbi starts the class uncertain as to how he will proceed. Suddenly, the door opens and an old man, much older than the rabbi, enters. He is the grandfather of the rabbi, Reb Chaim Brisker. It would be most difficult to study Talmud with students who are trained in the sciences of mathematics, were it not for his method, which is very modern and equals, if not surpasses, most contemporary forms of logic, metaphysics, and philosophy. The door again opens, and another old man comes in. He is older than Reb Chaim, for he lived in the 17th century. His name is Reb Shabtai Cohen, known as the Shach, who must be present when civil law is discussed. Many more visitors arrive, some from the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, and others harking back to antiquity. Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi, Rambam, Ravid, Rashba, Rabbi Akiva, and others. These scholarly giants of the past are bidden to take their seats. The rabbi introduces the guests to his pupils, and the dialogue commences. So, if you will, we will be inviting the Rambam into our classroom today, in the hopes of getting a glimpse, in a very general fashion, what the Rambam would say about a number of topics in the world of medicine today. Let us start with preventive medicine. What would the Rambam say about preventative medicine? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So the Rambam in Hilchos Deos deviates from the rest of his halachic writings. The Rambam, as we well know, and as we discussed at the beginning of our lecture, was very familiar with the world of medicine and has extensive writings in the world of medicine. You will not find in any of the Rambam's medical writings discussion of halacha, and the converse is largely true. You will rarely find medical discussions in all the halachic works of the Rambam. Of course, if the Gemara is discussing medicine, the Rambam will discuss the Gemara. Although, interestingly, the Rambam omits a number of medical passages in the Gemara, and there's been, of course, discussion as to why he would have done that. Maybe he didn't think it was proper medicine. Each one of those is analyzed in its own right. But in Hilchos Deos, he clearly has a lengthy explication of preventive medicine practices. And you could say really that the Rambam is the pioneer of preventive medicine, the great grandfather, if you will, of preventive medicine. And he writes in Halacha Aleph of Perek Daled, since maintaining a healthy body is consistent with the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's impossible to learn, to understand the concepts and precepts of the Torah if you are ill. Therefore, you should refrain from things which harm or damage your body. And he goes on to list in some roughly 20 halachos every aspect of eating and types of foods and when the foods should be eaten, and when liquids should be ingested in conjunction with or separate from foods, sleeping habits, etc., etc. And here Dr. Fred Rosner wrote an article in the Journal of History of Medicine and Allied Sciences in 1996, Maimonides, and preventive medicine. Dr. Rosner, by the way, in addition to the wonderful works that he has written over the many years, translated the Rambam's work into the Rambam's medical works into English from the Hebrew, from Zussman Mutner's Hebrew. He translated them into English, and he actually amassed an extraordinary personal collection of rare works of the Rambam, which he has given to the institute in Haifa called the Maimonides Institute in Haifa of Rabbi Asaf. So that amazing collection of Fred Rosner today is in Haifa. And at the end of his halachos, the Rambam makes an extraordinary promise. And he writes, "Kol hamanhig atzma b'drachim elu." After he gives a litany of advice about how to lead one's life and the preventive measures in all aspects of health. If you follow my advice, he says, "Ani arev lo she'eno boli decholi kol yomov." I, in essence, promise you that you will not become sick your entire life. Ad sheyazkin harbe. Until you become very old. Rabbi Tatz, maybe he's alluding here that if you follow his advice, you could live a few hundred years. The einot tzarich l'rofe. You will not need any physician. V'yeh gufa shalom v'omid al boryo kol yamav. And you will have you'll be in the pinnacle of health your entire lives. But he has some qualifications there. What is the exception, the qualifications? If someone had predisposition to disease from birth. So what is the Rambam alluding to here? Some genetic conditions which would preclude health or different aspects of health. It's a foreshadowing of different genetic conditions. And interestingly, apropos where we find ourselves today, o im tavo makas dever, or if there is a plague. So the Rambam can't promise you that if you follow all his suggestions, that you will not fall victim to a plague like COVID-19 or other of its predecessors. And for another discussion, the theology of plague in terms of how it afflicts people specifically. Are the people that die or are afflicted during plague, are they people that necessarily have been sinners, or is there indiscriminate loss of life in times of plague? And how did HaKadosh Baruch Hu design plague in terms of that theological dimension? That merits its own discussion. Even today, there are people who turn to the Rambam and apply the Rambam's principles to how they lead their lives from a health perspective. So here's an article from Nutrition Reviews, seated at the table with Rashi and Rambam, extracting the food habits of Rambam. And there's a book called The Life Transforming Diet, Health and Psychological Principles of Maimonides. And there's some people who are actually looking for cures, medical cures, or treatments of current diseases by a detailed analysis of the works of the Rambam. People have also turned to the Rambam for his approach to the patient. And there's an article from the journal on your side of the pond, The Lancet, equivalent to our Journal of the American Medical Association here in the United States, back in 2001, called Maimonides' Contribution to the Biopsychosocial Approach in Clinical Medicine. And the author concludes, the medical writings of Maimonides are a rich repository to gain an appreciation of the biopsychosocial foundation of clinical practice. I hope my reading and interpretation of his work has provided an insight into how doctors of the 21st century might fulfill their clinical role more effectively through the adoption of a Maimonidean position. What would the Rambam say about anatomical dissection? Now, here it's important to appreciate that one would think that the Rambam would clearly discuss issues of anatomical dissection. He trained as a physician. How could you train as a physician and not know anatomy? And we just discussed this 7-chambered uterus, which seems to reflect the fact that perhaps they didn't know so much anatomy at the times of the Rambam. And the truth of the matter is, you will not find any discussion of anatomical dissection or autopsy in the works of the Rambam, nor will you find them in the Shulchan Aruch. The very first mention that you find is the classic tshuva of the Nod of Yehuda. I don't have a copy of the Nod of Yehuda here, but the tshuva of the Nod of Yehuda, Reish Yud Yeridea, where he talks about autopsy there, and his famous psak about only being allowed to perform an autopsy if there's a chola lefanenu, somebody who will directly and immediately benefit. So this actually is a picture of the fabric of the human body by Andreas Vesalius, who's a professor of anatomy at the University of Padua in northern Italy. He's considered to be the pioneer of systematic anatomical dissection. Just an interesting parenthesis for us Jews, this classic work, The Fabric of the Human Body, considered one of the great works of all of medical history, has magnificent illustrations, and it has terms in multiple languages for the anatomy. Here you say vena cava. So they're in Latin, they're in Greek, and some of the terms are also in this language, which some of you may be familiar with, which is really quite remarkable. This is, if anyone want to hazard a guess what this says, actually it says haorti, which refers to the aorta. Now you might ask me appropriately, this is clearly the venous system, especially those of you in the medical field. And it says vena cava here, so why doesn't it say Hebrew equivalent to vena cava? Why does it say the aorta? So some have actually claimed that the person who helped Vesalius with his Hebrew wasn't so sharp, didn't have a great grasp of the anatomy. But there's a debate about this. This is believed to be the person who helped him. He's actually in the picture here. His name is Lazarus de Phrygius, probably from Blazer and Schull. Looks kind of like Moses with his fez. He's apparently the person who assisted Vesalius. Let's now turn to a few. The hours. Apologize, it's already 5:20. I'm not going to go 5:35. Is that okay, guys? I don't want to go too
Please,
too late.
please, as long as you want. This is
okay. I mean, I don't mind. I don't mind going longer. People who need to leave, feel free to leave. I won't be offended. And also, I can't even see if you're leaving because I'm looking at the PowerPoint anyway, so I definitely won't be offended. This case, I'm a little hesitant to talk about in the presence of the master, Rabbi Tatz, who has spoken many, many times about this extraordinary case. But it's just an indication of what the Rambam would paskin today. And we'll go through some contemporary cases. This is a famous case. We're only going to mention it very briefly. One of the most challenging cases in the history of Jewish medical ethics. It's a case that dates back to 1977 of a case of twins that were conjoined twins and shared one 6-chambered heart. And there was no way they would survive without intervention. With intervention, only one could survive. So the question was, could you sacrifice one to save the life of the other? And the surgeon at that time was C. Everett Koop. This is the famous case of the conjoined twins, Cheng and Eng Bunker, who were known, they were from Siam. That's why their twins are called the Siamese twins. They were exhibited by Barnum and Bailey Circus for many years. They, by the way, were offered to separate. They were Thoracopagus twins. They were connected at the chest wall. They could have been easily separated later in life, but they chose not to. They had separate wives and separate families. How that worked, I'm not exactly sure. There are also people who are connected by the skull or by the brain. Those are called Craniopagus twins, and this is a case that was successfully separated in Israel a number of years ago. This year, September of this past year. But just to share with you very briefly what the Rambam would have said on this case, and in essence, we know what the Rambam would have said on this case, or could have said on this case, because the Rambam was invoked in the decision about how to address this case by none other than Rav Moshe Feinstein's Zatzal. In this very complex case, which we're just highlighting one idea, and I highly recommend you listen to the full shiur of Rabbi Tatz on this remarkable case. But Rav Moshe ultimately paskined, inspired by the words of the Rambam, as to how to deal with this case. And he made a very clear determination from C. Everett Koop that one of the fetuses. One of the twins was a primary twin, or had greater ownership, if you will, over the heart, or more likelihood of survival, and the other was a secondary twin, or perhaps a parasitic twin. which was taking the life from the other twin and probably could not have been able to survive on his own. And based on those facts, Moshe Feinstein invoked the halacha of the Rambam, fascinating halacha of Rodef. And he writes, one shouldn't have any mercy on a pursuer. Therefore, the rabbis have concluded that when a woman is having difficulty during childbirth, it is permitted to abort the fetus in her womb, for the fetus is considered a rodef of its mother. Why the Rambam invokes rodef is one of the fascinating questions of halacha, which has occupied hundreds, if not thousands, of pages on the interpretation of this particular passage. But Moshe Feinstein invoked this Rambam, and he compared the case of Siamese twins to this classic case of the conflict for survival between a mother and child and fetus. Baby A had no independent ability to survive. Her entire survival was completely dependent on her sister, who had the circulatory system to back up the functioning of the heart and liver. So while there is much to discuss, Moshe applied the Rambam's notion of rodef here, that the parasitic twin, if you will, was being rodef the primary twin, or twin A. As a result, it would be permissible to sacrifice the life of the parasitic twin to save the second twin. As to whether this would apply to other areas, contemporary areas, so for example, in the same area of medicine, in the world of fertility and neonatology and reproduction, it has now become exceedingly common for women to carry multiples, higher order multiples in pregnancy, including triplets, quadruplets, up to 8 or 9. Have been reported. There was a case of 10 that was reported, but that was a false report that I don't think we've seen yet. But the question which has arisen in these kinds of cases, and there's two reasons why there's been an increase in multiple gestational pregnancies. Reason number one is due to assisted reproduction, physicians implant embryos, and there is no legal restriction or limitation as to how many embryos can be implanted. So in the earlier days, not so much today, physicians used to implant 4, 5, 6, 7 embryos in the hopes that at least a few of them would take. Sometimes all of them would successfully implant, and you'd have many, you'd have sextuplets, septuplets, octuplets, and it would be a serious risk to all the fetuses with such a small womb for them to survive. And the other reason also in the world of fertility is not because the doctors are implanting these embryos, but rather they are administering drugs which stimulate ovulation. And sometimes a woman will ovulate multiple eggs, and all the eggs could be fertilized, resulting in a multi-gestational pregnancy. So the question has been asked of poskim of rabbinic authorities over the past few decades since the development of these technologies, whether it's permitted to decrease the term in medicine is selective reduction, but it's really a euphemism for selective abortion, in order to decrease the number of fetuses to increase the likelihood of better survival and health. So can one selectively reduce? So here the question is, can you invoke the same notion of rodef? And some have invoked the notion of rodef here. Would the Rambam invoke the notion of rodef? Not a simple answer here, because while the Rav Moshe was clearly adamant about determining that there was an asymmetry in order to apply rodef, here there isn't necessarily an asymmetry. All the fetuses are in a state of reciprocal redifa. They are all simultaneously pursuing each other. So there's no clear A or B or primary or secondary. So invoking the notion of rodef here becomes a little more challenging. Not so clear if the Rambam would in fact invoke that in this particular case or not. Stem cell research would be interesting to know what the Rambam would say about stem cell research. What's unique about stem cell research is we have an embryo outside the human body. Now, the Rambam seems to say that absent the notion of rodef, if there's no scenario where the life of the mother is at risk, there may not be license to sacrifice the life of the fetus. So that's something which needs to be discussed here. But what would the Rambam say about an embryo that finds itself ex utero, embryo that finds itself outside the human body? Would he apply the same principles of the requirement for rodef, or maybe an embryo outside the human body would have less status because it doesn't have halachic potential as a fetus inside the body? So fetus inside the body, for example, the halacha is very clear. You're allowed to be mechal Shabbos for a 6-month fetus. Even if fetus less than 40 days, you're allowed to be mechal Shabbos. But are you allowed to be mechal Shabbos for an embryo in the laboratory? So most of today's poskim would say the answer to that is no. Would the Rambam also make that distinction between ex utero and in utero? We unfortunately don't have evidence to determine. Genetics is another fascinating area where the Rambam could weigh in on. This is a magnificent illustration of a Sefer Torah made from DNA. So a Torah is clearly part of our DNA, but I would argue the reciprocal, the converse is also true, that DNA or medicine or science is also very much part of our Torah. There's one interesting aspect where we might have some insight how the Rambam would paskin. Of course, there are many issues to discuss about the world of genetics, but one issue, which is an important issue and a real halacha l'maaseh issue, is disclosure of information and disclosure of the existence of genetic disease. Today, many people are doing testing. There's wonderful organizations that are doing testing. JScreen is a new organization on the scene over the last few years, testing for close to 200 different diseases. If you find out that you are a carrier for a disease, or that you contain a predisposition gene, like a gene for breast cancer, etc., are you obligated to disclose that kind of information? So many people turn to the Rambam for guidance in terms of disclosing information in general, and the Rambam subsumes it under his discussion of lo sa'amod al dam re'echa. So the Rambam says, don't stand idly by as the blood of your brother is being shed. That clearly includes discussion about saving the physical lives of others, which we'll discuss in just a moment about halachic ramifications there. But the Rambam also says that it includes Oshi Yeda Ba'akum O Be'ones Shehu Ba'al Chavero V'yochal Afaiso B'glal Chavero L'Hasir Mashe B'livo Lo Piso V'chala Yotzi B'dvarim Elu Ha'oso Som Over Lo Samado Dam Re'echa. So not only does it involve saving life, but it also involves withholding information, valuable information that could be detrimental to somebody. So many people turn to this Rambam in terms of guidance about the necessity to disclose information that if the person was not familiar with this information, might make a transaction, and a transaction includes marriage, which is also a form of transaction, and a faulty transaction without knowing the information that they would need to know to make that kind of transaction. So how that would be applied, to what diseases that would be applied, is a matter of debate. There's a wonderful work from PUA, the organization PUA, where they actually itemize many different diseases and go into great detail about which specific diseases, including physical diseases and diseases of mental health, for which one would be required to disclose, and those for which one would not be required to disclose, as well as those which would be ideal to disclose but not necessarily obligatory. What would the Rambam say about plastic surgery today? Plastic surgery has really exponentially increased in our lifetimes. This is just a list of 20 of the more popular forms of plastic surgery. Liposuction. You don't need me to read this for you. You're all familiar with these kinds of plastic surgery. The question is, you're violating the bodily integrity. You're causing a wound. Chavala, wounding someone is a prohibition. Would you be allowed to do such a thing in order to achieve a greater, more beautiful appearance? Is that something which would be considered halachically appropriate or not? So here, Moshe Feinstein Zatzal, in a classic tshuva, probably one of the earliest tshuvas of the modern discussions of plastic surgery, invokes the Rambam to establish a principle which is applied to plastic surgery, and as we'll see, to other areas as well. And here, the case was a remarkable case of a young woman who had very poor self-image. Probably today would be body dysmorphic syndrome, would be the psychological diagnosis. And her nose, she thought her nose was not very pleasant for the eyes. And furthermore, not only was this impacting on her notions of self-worth, it was also impacting on her ability to, her marriage ability. So she asked if it was permissible to undergo, at that time, rhinoplasty, which is one of the few major plastic surgeries available. Now there are, of course, many, many more. So Moshe actually paskined, for a variety of reasons, that indeed it would be permissible to do so, but he invoked the Rambam in Perek Chovel, where he writes that yes, it's prohibited to cause damage or harm or wound somebody, but the Rambam qualifies this, and the Rambam says, one cannot cause bodily damage or wounding neither to himself or to others. However, only if it is done. What's the prohibition? The prohibition, if it's done derech nitzayon, or as some say, derech bizayon. So he qualifies this, and this qualification is unique to the Rambam, and says wounding is only prohibited if it has no positive purpose, if it's done in a destructive fashion, if it's done to desecrate the body, to degrade the body. So Moshe picks this up and says, this is clearly not done for a destructive purpose. This is done for an ultimate positive value. So he, employing this principle of the Rambam, says that it would be permitted. How this would be applied to different plastic surgeries is a matter of contemporary poskim, and each surgery, of course, as surgeries get more severe and more expansive and more extreme, one would have to consider the halachic details for each procedure. Same thing applies to another very popular procedure, which thankfully is helping many, many people today, and that's the ability to donate an organ from one living human being to another human being. Living organ donation has been going on since the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s. Started out actually earlier than that. Started with cornea donation and kidney donation. So the question is it halachically permitted? What will the Rambam say about somebody donating a kidney? Here too, you're clearly undergoing chavala, and it's not just a minor chavala. It's a major chavala. You are receiving an abdominal incision. You're removing one of your kidneys. So surely this does not fall into the category of derech bizayon. Quite the contrary. This is not something done for the purpose of desecration or destruction. This is for the ultimate higher value of potentially saving a life. And there's no question that the Rambam would be matir living organ donation today. There's a magnificent organization which you in the United Kingdom may be familiar with, although it's based here in the United States. It's called Renewal. Here I just mentioned, this is February 9th, a few weeks ago. They always post little blurbs. Here happens to be a member of the Sephardic community. Bobby, a member of the Sephardic community, has waited 6 long years for this day. From the time that he registered with us to the day of transplant, Bobby is one of our longest waiting transplants. First, it took years for him to get cleared by the hospital at age 80, and then his transplant was canceled 6 times, and finally, Baruch Hashem, he got a transplant on February 9th. Really amazing. They have facilitated, this organization called Renewal, over 500 transplants in just a few years' time, and it's really it's a really tremendous Kiddush Hashem. What about selling organs? You know what I'm going to do, just in the interest of time, I'm going to spend a few moments, like 2 or 3 minutes on COVID, and then close up and then open for questions if anybody has any questions. What would the Rambam say about issues relating to COVID and COVID-19? Obviously, it would have been nice if we had the Rambam to guide us through this, but Baruch Hashem, we have many Gedolim today, including Rav Asher Weiss Shlita, that's posted on the Torah Sarafua. Had some amazing postings just over the last few days, who's guided us through these very challenging times. So what would the Rambam say about taking risks? So the Rambam, we said, Lo samud al dam re'echa, would also require us to take at least a limited risk in order to save others, to save people's lives. This is actually me in my hazmat gear. My clinical practice is emergency medicine. I work at one of the major centers here in New York. So suffice it to say, it's been a challenging time the last few years. But what would the Rambam say about vaccination? Do you think the Rambam would be an anti-vaxxer? So if anyone here thinks the Rambam would be an anti-vaxxer, I think we have to have a serious conversation about your understanding of the Rambam. There is little doubt that the Rambam would have strongly supported vaccines. The Rambam clearly integrated science. As we said, the Rambam wrote a Perush on Galen, wrote a Perush on Hippocrates, granted with his commentaries and his criticisms. But the Rambam clearly integrated contemporaneous medicine, in addition to his integration to a large extent of the work of others, including Aristotle, which has been the substance of many academic discussions today too. The Rambam, as Rav Asher Weiss has discussed a number of times in the Rambam, you will find many discussions about health preservation, about cases of imminent danger, where there's a chiyuv d'oraisa, cases of potential danger, where there's isurim d'Rabbanan, and preventive measures, which we talked about in Perek Daled of Hilchos Deos. There's little question in the midst of this pandemic, the Rambam would have strongly supported vaccination. What would the Rambam say about cloning? So honestly, I have no clue what the Rambam would say about cloning. But if we did clone the Rambam, and we went to Tveria, and we took a tiny piece, if it was halachically permissible, to take from the kever and clone the Rambam, then the one thing we would solve is we would finally know what the Rambam actually looks like. And if all these pictures that we've been reproducing century after century are an accurate depiction of the Rambam or not. So in conclusion, we've had an opportunity to discuss the history of the Rambam and engage in a thought experiment, which obviously could be expanded, of how the Rambam would paskin, or what the Rambam's thoughts would be on a number of contemporary issues in the 21st century. I would be delighted to entertain any questions. And again, a tremendous chus to join these two extraordinary groups, and I look forward to learning from both of your groups in the future.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. That was amazing, very insightful. And if anyone has any questions, you can find in reactions at the bottom. You can raise your hand. And Rabbi, there's also questions in the chat box.
Yes, I'm going to look for those too. Great. Okay, so they knew anatomy with Hilchos Trefos. Yes, and in fact, the rabbis, Chazal, probably had a better understanding than other societies because of the necessity to dissect for Hilchos Trefos. And there actually is a Gemara in Bechoros on Mem Dalet, I believe, of a fascinating account of the students of Rabbi Shmuel who dissected a woman after the post-mortem dissection. And it has interesting halachic ramifications. They dissected the Mishnah in Oelo says Ramach Evarim Yesh Ba'adam, the 248 Evarim. However, those Evarim are to be defined. The students of Rabbi Shmuel dissected the body, and they found out there weren't 248; there were 252. Or different Gersos, maybe 253. So why the discrepancy? So one of the answers is that that they dissected a woman. And there's a difference in the organs between a man and a woman. Now, one thing that tells us is that they clearly are not talking about bones, because there is no difference between the number of bones of a man and the number of bones of a woman. There's maybe a difference in the angle of the spine and the pelvis, but there is no difference. But how's that halacha l'maisa translated to today? Some shuls make a different Misha Berach for men and different Misha Berach for women on Shabbos, for the Misha Berach l'chola. There's only one textual difference between those two. For the men, it says they should have a refuah shlema l'ramach evarehem l'shasagi dehem, to their 248 evarim and to their 365 gidim, however that's to be defined. But for women, they can't say that based on the Gemara, because women don't have ramach evarim. Women have more. So it says the text is changed l'chol evarehem l'chol gidehem. Now the question is, what do they do for Shema when you need 248 for the Shema? So should women add extra? So there's some poskim who say that women should add extra words to equal 252. Interesting discussions. The risk for general anesthesia and plastic surgery. The risk of general anesthesia today is extremely small. So the poskim writing in the 60s and the 70s are writing about the risks of general anesthesia, and that weighs very heavily in halachic discussions. Today, the risk of anesthesia is exceedingly small, and I suggest you listen to. I can try and remember, and I'll send you. There's a talk by Rav Herschel Schechter, Shlita from YU, Rosh Yeshiva of YU, on plastic surgery, and I was actually it was astounding to me how remarkably lenient he was in terms of plastic surgeries today. I was to be honest, I was surprised to hear him. Obviously, halachically, he's the gaon of halacha, but I was always sort of trained that plastic surgery was generally not considered in many circumstances permitted. But based on his halachic analysis, especially appreciating that anesthesia is not as dangerous as it was in the past times. Let's see. Any other questions while I'm looking at the chat here?
We have Sina.
Dr. Reichman, thank you so much for the class. Really, really fascinating. I had a question. I know that Rabbeinu Avraham ben HaRambam in his Sefer HaMaspik relates to his take that the medical or scientific sayings of Chazal aren't necessarily things that are binding eternally. Do we see anything like that in HaRambam's writings?
Right. So the question is he reflecting the famous passage from Avram ben HaRambam, where in essence he says, which has been perpetuated, throughout the centuries by other people, and there's a wonderful passage by Shimshon Raphael Hirsch also, in essence saying that the Chazal were not scientists or physicians; they were masters of halacha, and they relied heavily on contemporaneous medicine. And by the way, Rav Asher Weiss Shlita has made a very strong case, and many times in many wonderful shiurim, showing how Chazal have always relied on experts in many different fields, including in the fields of medicine. Actually, the book that was recently published, in essence, the premise of the book is, or the approach of the book really is to analyze many of the writings of Chazal throughout the centuries or the millennia, and to enlighten the sources based on the contemporaneous medicine that it was understood at the time. So that's really now as to what poskim will do with that. That's that's a matter of debate, a matter of discussion. But many of these sources you simply cannot understand without understanding the medicine that was contemporary to them, because they're using terms, they're using expressions, and if we're trying to extrapolate to today, we would be doing a disservice if we didn't understand it in its own historical context. But the assumption is that the Rambam did follow that as well. I mean, the Rambam clearly says you should follow the rational science, the rational academic pursuits, no matter where they come from. If they're appropriately and academically sound, we should follow them.
Thank you so much.
By the way, there's a wonderful work called Sefer Hishtanut HaTvaim by Neria Gutal. Unfortunately, not yet been translated into English, but he gathers many of the issues on this interface of Nishtana Hateva.
I'll also like to point out that Rosh Bet Midrash, Rabbi Dweck, is over here. So, hello, Rav.
Hi, Dr. Reichman. I just wanted to, I'm sorry that I could not be here for the entire shiur. I heard the tail end, and I'm looking very forward to hearing the recording. I know that it is a diamond in the treasury of the Chabura. And I'm on behalf of the entire Bet Midrash, I want to thank you so much for taking your time to share of your wisdom and insights to all of the Chaverim. Anvatechat Arbenu. It's a tremendous zchut to have you with us. Thank you very, very much. And
the zchut is absolutely mine. I had kol hakavod to the. So if don't listen to the entire shiur, but just listen to the beginning where I praise the Chabura. That part's the most important part of the shiur.
Thank you very much for doing so, and please God, we should live up to the Hallel. But thank you, and I see Kvod Rav Tatz, an honor to have you with us tonight. Thank you also for taking the time. It's wonderful to have you in the Midrash, in the virtual Midrash.
I think we have a question in the chat about conjoined twins.
Let's see. With regard to the conjoined twins, why apply the halacha regarding a fetus in utero? And Maimonides qualifies there's a distinction between a fetus that's already emerged and one that is still in utero. So that is an excellent question, and it's not so clear. It's not so directly applicable, and that's why I sort of use the word inspired by or guided by the Rambam. And this is something, by the way, that Rabbi Tatz also discusses in his shiurim in terms of the applicability of the discussion of the Rambam, which is pre-birth to a case where these conjoined twins were actually born. There's some other fascinating halachic shilas about conjoined twins in terms of Yerusha, the Yoresh too, in terms of tefillin. The Shvus Yaakov has a famous shilah about tefillin for Craniopagus twins, two twins that are conjoined at the head. So do they have to each put on a separate pair of tefillin, or is one pair of tefillin enough? Are conjoined twins allowed to marry two different wives, like Cheng and Eng Bunker, or are there isurim involved in that? Are two heads really better than one? That's really the what it comes down to.
If I may ask, so we brought before how Rambam brought his scientific understanding in the beginning of Mishnah Torah, and the question is, why does he actually do that, especially if he knew that the science does change?
So in Hilchos Deos, actually, it's as opposed to today where things really change, really evolve. One could argue that many of his suggestions are timeless. He's talking about some innate aspects of nature, of vegetation, of vegetables and fruits, and drinking and eating and sleeping. And in fact, there are many people who claim that we should return to those days, and maybe the Rambam's promise that if we did adhere to his recommendations, we would lead a longer life. Maybe we should give it a try, as opposed to all these fad diets that we're all trying for a quick fix. So he's not really mentioning any technologies which have been disproven or no longer valid. Although we did mention the 8-month baby, where the Rambam clearly was accepting of the understanding of the 8-month fetus, which is not in consonance with our contemporary understanding. So that requires a different type of analysis, and maybe an invoking of a concept of nishtana teva. But the Rambam generally doesn't mention a lot of the things in the Gemara that are magical or superstitious or of questionable medical validity. Tends to omit a lot of those.
Okay. Do we have any final questions? Okay, fine. Thank you so much, Rabbi. That was extremely insightful and amazing. Thank you so much, the Torah Refuah Institute, for co-hosting with us today. And please follow us for more of the amazing things we are doing at the Chabura. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It was an amazing shiur.
Thank you all so much. Tremendous chus. Kol hakavod, and look forward to seeing you in person in the near future, as opposed to Zing you by Zoom.
Amen.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a good night.
Much.